There's something strange going on in the Canadian economy. At first glance, it actually looks like it's doing fairly well. The country's GDP has continued to hum along, averaging above 2% growth between 2011 and 2019, and just above 1% in the years from 2020 to 2022. This puts it only behind the US among G7 countries. But if we look a little bit closer, specifically at Canada's population growth, it's growing the fastest in the G7. And its population is growing at a speed similar to or even exceeding its GDP growth. And this means GDP per capita is stagnating. It's roughly the same level it was back in 2018. So, what's contributing to this stagnation? Well, largely it's low productivity. Okay, but what does that mean? What is productivity? Productivity in economics is the output generated from an input, such as labor or capital, typically measured in GDP per hours worked. And improving living standards is almost entirely dependent on increasing productivity. To understand why, just think of all the ways in which innovation has saved time for you or around you. Imagine doing construction where instead of heavy equipment, everyone dug with shovels. Or imagine transporting goods across Canada without the use of transport trucks, trains, or boats. It would be awful. A highly productive economy is able to accomplish far more with fewer people in less time. In a highly competitive global market, a low productivity country is less attractive to do business in, so this country could be skipped over when looking at where to operate. Now, productivity in Canada still has grown over the last few decades, it's just that it hasn't grown at the same pace as in peer countries. In 1980, Canada ranked 4th among OECD countries, well above the G7 average. Today, Canada is ranked 18th, behind the G7, EU, and OECD average. And this is predicted to get worse as time goes on. The main reasons behind this sluggish improvement is a combination of decreasing competition among businesses, low investment, and high regulation. These are also intertwined, and so they feed back on each other. In the last 20 years, competition has declined among many business sectors in Canada. Smaller firms are less willing to challenge larger firms, and fewer new companies are entering the market. This is largely the result of policy laid out in the 1980s in the Competition Act. The act favored large corporate mergers and market protections as a way of protecting Canadian businesses that were perceived as not resilient enough to compete globally. And the result is predictable. A small number of companies hold monopolies in various industries such as banking, telecoms, and grocery retail, just to name a few. The biggest problem in the Competition Act is the so-called efficiencies clause. This lets corporations argue that a merger will allow them to cut costs. The problem, of course, is that in the long run, reduced competition means no reason to improve or innovate, and this leads to the higher costs it was supposed to prevent in the first place. This low competition environment leads to the next problem, which is low investment. But it's not the only cause. Business leaders have long argued for higher levels of immigration. And while high immigration does give the Canadian economy an edge over some of its peer countries, which are seeing their populations decline and all of the problems that come with that, a steady flow of readily available labor means that businesses are never forced to invest in more productive solutions, which are normally the result of labor shortages. To top this off, housing has become increasingly expensive and therefore lucrative in Canada. This has driven many Canadians' money into the housing market, where they can expect to see high returns on their investment instead of into other industries. And investing in the housing market doesn't create the same knock-on effects in the economy that investing in companies that, for example, build infrastructure would. A house isn't going to transport goods and people for you, but a new train line could. Canada's regulatory measures need updating to meet the current moment. Various protections in place for industries such as dairy or broadcasting have shielded their respective industries from competition, and the series of provincial rent control programs are in part responsible for less housing supply, which has driven up the cost of housing, culminating in this low investment environment. Okay, so how does Canada remedy these problems and boost productivity? This is going to require broad structural reform in the form of updates to the Competition Act, removal of protections such as supply management, and modernization of various trade agreements, both domestically between provinces and internationally. Canadians are going to need to engage themselves more in understanding how they can affect politics, not just by voting in federal elections, but in provincial and municipal as well, where many of these regulations are affected. Canada could also take a page out of Australia's playbook and create a commission for increasing productivity. The commission would have a mandate of producing research for policy changes with a goal of boosting productivity by a set percentage year on year. Canada continues to have an incredibly high standard of living, but to ensure that this is going to continue, these broad changes are going to need to start happening soon. If you're still here, thanks for watching all the way to the end. Remember to subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.